The first point on success, I have to say, is borrow a friend's watch. That way you don't make a fool of yourself by going over time. Thank you, Avi. Um, the only way to respond after or come after such a powerful start is to slow things down. And so what I'm going to do really is I'm going to take you through what I feel is, the key lessons that we need to think through as we build global organizations from emerging markets, and leave you probably with more questions than answers, because I feel it's very important for all of us here in this room, and I'm not going to talk about India. That's been very comprehensively covered, and most of you are from India anyway, so who am I to tell you how things should be done there. But what I would like to do really is to set the stage a little bit for what is the world that we're facing today, and what is the marketplace that we face as we try and build global companies. This environment, this macro theme is crucially important because the world in which we are building global companies is very different from the world in which today's global companies were built in the past. And it's extremely important to understand and recognize that we're probably living through a fairly seminal change in the way the world, in essence, has grown and the financial markets have grown. We've all, whilst in university and in the start of our careers, thought through and understood that any business needs to be, any reward that comes from business has to be evaluated in the context of risk. We've all been taught in colleges and in our professional jobs that risk always carries a premium, and emerging market risk always carried a greater premium from starting businesses in developed markets. The real reality, ladies and gentlemen, is that when risk came in 2008, it came from the heart of capitalism. It came from New York City. And that risk was unquantified by virtually everyone that was building risk models for another very important reason, and that's called greed. Almost everyone that was operating in markets in the 10 years preceding the crash in 2008 was operating on the basis of greed. Everybody was making money. Everybody was doing extremely well. And when the crash came, and it came from New York City and from the banking sector, what didn't happen immediately thereafter is we didn't take stock and we didn't change our systems fast enough. We didn't punish fast enough. We didn't change regulations fast enough. And the sovereign crisis that we saw last year is just a natural corollary, a natural continuation of the same process. So these state of affairs, and I know I have to talk about how to build global organizations. I feel very humble because I don't have a clue, because it's still work in progress. But what I would like to do is to sort of put through pointers. But first we must talk about what these global themes are that we face today, because anybody here in this audience outside trying to build a great company has to understand that you cannot build an island of prosperity in an ocean of turbulence. And what's out there is very, very turbulent. So what are the 5 themes that we see in the world today? The first, of course, is the great deleveraging, as I call it. We're in the early stages of this deleveraging cycle. Private sector debt has shrunk. Public sector debt has mushroomed. Of course, one of the ways that you can shrink private sector debt is to default on your mortgages, which is what most people in the US seem to be doing. The second big theme that we face today is the challenges within the EU. I'm not going to talk about the politics of it. Everybody here has just lived through it. But what I would like to point out is, as a result, what we're facing clearly, globally, is a crisis of leadership. No one has stood up and said, here's the way. We need governments and leaders of governments to be doing that. We don't have a Roosevelt. We don't have a Gandhi. We don't have a Churchill. And sadly, with all the euphoria and the hopes that the world had, in the leaders that recently got elected, that hasn't happened either. The second big thing that comes out of the European crisis is the fact that policymakers are dealing with issues on a supranational level. That, again, hasn't been done. We've seen countries deal with it. We've never seen, groups of countries deal with it. And this is a major theme, because what you have as a result is stock markets, which are increasingly globalized and are working in tandem across the world, are now being driven by policy. They're not being driven by fundamental analysis. So how on earth can you put your stock and your faith in reading about the performance of stock markets because they're going up and down fairly yo-yoistically, if that's a word I can use, and are driven more by the feel-good factor as opposed to the fundamental analysis that belies how companies should be performing. The third thing, of course, the theme that we see today is there are massive political implications behind the changes that are going on. There is increased inequality in the world today. There's reduced socioeconomic mobility in the world today, and there is a large dissent amongst the masses. What we saw a year ago when we talked about the Arab Spring was a euphoria. We all got a little bit excited that there is going to be youth empowerment, there is going to be democracy, there is going to be freedom in various things that we were not otherwise used to. The reality is the system has closed ranks. The system, wherever it may be, in Syria or Libya or Egypt or what have you, has come together, and today it's no longer about that youth. It's no longer about the economic downtrodden nature of the masses, the phenomenal level of unemployment. It is about the political system. And that too is throwing up some very, very interesting scenarios, because what we have by the Muslim Brotherhood parties being elected across virtually all of North Africa is another scenario where we keep saying democracy needs to come to the fore. Well, that's what democracy is giving us, and we have to give it a chance. The other thing that I find remarkable in today's world is, and something nobody is dealing with, is the youth is massively, massively being neglected. Despite our focus on it, we talked about the Arab Spring. What we don't realize is that today we are facing a phenomenon which we have not faced before, which is called graduate unemployment. We sent our kids to universities with the promise that their lives are going to be better. Well, Spain has 25% graduate unemployment. Egypt, Tunisia, and so on, similar sorts of numbers. And what I'd like to say is this graduate unemployment is going to lead to social unrest, and it wasn't about the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring youth in Tahrir Square had more in common with the people that came out in the streets in London, with the Occupy Wall Street movement, with the riots in Tokyo. And the reason for that is because they are socially mobile across a new phenomenon, which is called community. So whether it's Facebook, whether it's Twitter, whatever it is, they're more in touch with each other, and therefore the trends that are happening, then their hierarchies are with them. Governments are in danger of becoming disintermediated from the understanding of what people actually want. So that's another theme that I feel very strongly is something that we all need to focus on, because alongside uncertainty on the politics, clearly this is the world that we face. I'm not going to talk any more about politics, otherwise you'll think that I'm trying to run for public office somewhere. But there is a massive silver lining in all of this, and it is what the world calls emerging markets. I certainly don't call it emerging markets. Francis, you said earlier that you took a bit of issue with it. I take a massive issue with it, because these are the growth markets. And again, it goes back to what I was telling you about how we were taught to analyze risk. We must not analyze these markets as emerging markets. This is the future of the world. And even the term emerging markets, by the way, only came about because some chap 20 years ago was trying to raise a fund called the Third World Equities Fund. And he couldn't raise any money, so he said, let's call it the Emerging Markets Fund, and became very rich and famous. But that's the reality. What is the market statistics that these growth markets show us? Our share from these markets in global GDP was 26% in 2001. Today, it's around 37%. By the end of this decade, it's going to be 50%. Are going to deliver anywhere from 45 to 55% of global growth in the next 10 years. Urban development is a key focus in choosing what tomorrow's growth company is going to become a global leader. And finally, the US consumer, which used to contribute 20% to the global GDP, is over time going to become increasingly irrelevant, because there is a new breed of consumers in these so-called emerging markets, in these growth markets. And these consumers want more of everything. They've all grown up watching aspirationally MTV. The reality is they want it. They don't want to read about it or watch it. They want it for themselves. Something like 1.2 billion people, up from 400 million people today, are going to be a part of the so-called middle classes in about 10 years' time. That 1.2 billion is more than the entire population of the OECD, just to give you an idea of where opportunity lies in these markets. So with this backdrop, what does it create? What does it take to create this global champion that we are seeking to understand the sort of essence of in today's discussions? What does it take to be that? Well, I'm going to take you back to 1953 to a gentleman by the name of Mr. Hassan, who had a dream, he had a vision, and he wanted to build ships. I'm pretty sure no one in this audience, unless I'm very wrong, knew who Mr. Hassan was. Well, Mr. Hassan had this vision. He wanted to build ships in a country that was destroyed by war, that was largely massively post-agrarian. It had no infrastructure. It had no skills and no industrialization. He didn't even have the money. He didn't have anyone to lend it to him. And what he did with that vision, he went out and he borrowed the money to build 2 ships because he got some Greek tycoon to order those ships because they were fairly inexpensive. And then, with the capital that he had found, instead of taking the profit, what he did is he put it to work in the communities in order to build an army of people that had gone through the technical skill set required to build ships. Mr. Hassan was the founder of a company called Hyundai. And that single individual changed the course of not only the shipbuilding industry worldwide, but his entire country's future. Because not only is it one of the largest shipbuilders in the world, but the socioeconomic benefits to the country in which he was operating, more than 1 million people, okay, which is 13% of the households in Korea, have gone through the vocational training program in Hyundai Industries. 13% of the people have been impacted by that. So what he took was his vision, his zeal, and communicated that across a vast spectrum of people to make them believers, provided them employment, and moved his framework onto a global footing. Had he decided that the environment was rubbish, that he would probably be better off going to work in Japan and so on, South Korea's history would be different, his history might have been different. There are numerous similar stories across the markets. We have Grupo Bimbo, strange name, but true, in Mexico, which today is a $10 billion turnover, and it is a bakery business. We have Gafisa in Brazil, which is one of the largest home builders in Brazil. We have Safaricom in Kenya. We have Reliance, Mahindra, Infosys, ICICI. We saw so many examples. Bharti Airtel from India. We have Astra in Indonesia. And in China, Huawei alone has filed more patents than any other company in the world. 16 companies in the Fortune 500 from China were on that list in 2001. It's now 61 companies, and that again is a very, very large number. Across the Arab world, a lot of you work with or in association with many, many, many great companies. We have Emirates Airlines, we have the Jumeirah Group of Hotels, all of these that have become global brands, Orascom in Egypt, Hikma Pharmaceutical in Jordan, the Olayan Group, the Aujan Group in Saudi Arabia, and so on. How did these companies get there? I've been trying to understand what makes good large, what makes large great, and why aren't there more companies in this league? From a personal perspective, I've been very fortunate in that I've worked with quite a few of these, and I felt like a little bit of a boy in a China store or in a chocolate factory, because every time I wanted something, I needed something, I'd reach out and touch it and so on. Private equity gives you that opportunity to buy companies across different sectors, understand them, help them, work with them, and grow with them. And so I feel I've built up a little bit of thinking around what it is that made these companies great. I'll give you the case of an example of a company that we owned called Acibadem. Acibadem is a hospital business in Turkey. When we bought into it 4 years ago, it was a $40 million EBITDA business and 700 beds. Over the last 3.5 to 4 years, that number has gone up to 1,500 beds, and EBITDA has gone up fourfold. As a result, we could integrate it with a company called IHH in Singapore, which together results in the second largest healthcare business in the world with over 5,000 beds, $5 billion of revenues, and a phenomenal growth trajectory because it operates in growth markets. Similarly, Aramex, which a lot of you have heard of as well, it was a Jordanian logistics company. When we bought it in 2001, it was a $60 million turnover company. In fact, we bought it for that value. When we sold it 4 years later, that number had multiplied many-fold, and in turn, today it's worth over $1 billion. Now, why did I choose these two examples? Or indeed, EFC, which was a fertilizer business which we bought in Egypt and which laid the foundations when we merged it with Orascom Construction to create one of the world's largest fertilizer platforms. Today, we're in the top 5 globally in nitrogen focus. Well, what I studied from these 3 companies, just to give you an example, is step 1 was that every one of the entrepreneurs that I worked with had an incredible self-belief, very knowledgeable about the macro industry in which they operated, and were very aware of their surroundings. Step 2, of course, as I pointed out in the case of Hyundai, was having a very, very clear mission, a dream, and a vision, which is also, it's difficult, but it's doable. But of course, step 3 is the key. We've all heard about it. It's intangible, but it's real. It's that focus, it's the passion, it's the undying obsession with excellence, the commitment, absolutely unswavering to get it done. It's almost bloody-mindedness, but it gets it done. And an appetite for hard work. All of this wrapped up in humility. We all tend to forget that, but it actually is an extremely real element of what we need when we build businesses. So, to build a good business, a great business, we need to have the entrepreneurial zeal, we need to have the spark, and we need to have, most important of all, alongside that humility, massive doses of good fortune. Believe in luck, because I see myself and many other people in this room as a product of that good fortune. But this is what makes profitable companies, what makes great companies, what makes companies cross borders. And then I found that there were some other commonalities. There was a little bit more that added to that spark. Knowing and playing to the competitive advantages of the company itself, and like you said, jugaad, right? Changing the rules of the game a little bit and creating a competitive advantage where it didn't exist. Crucial, critical. Personally, I like sports a lot. So I'll give you a sports example, which is, we know about Steve Jobs, we read books about people like that, Lou Wasserman, Michael Dell. But when we look at how do you change the game and take it to a completely different competitive level, there was a guy in the 80s called David Berkoff, who was an average swimmer. He then refined in particular a particular move or a technique which had been around for the last 50, 70 years, which is called the dolphin kick. By doing this technique and by perfecting it, he ended up winning 4 gold medals. And even Michael Phelps' success was a result of perfecting this technique. So you change the rules, you play the game the right way, but in a way which becomes competitively positive for you. Secondly, Darwin told us, donkeys years ago, he said, it's not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent, but rather the one that is most capable and adaptive to change. I keep telling my colleagues, today's peacock is tomorrow's feather duster. If you don't evolve, if you don't change, if you are not rapid enough and fast enough to want to go from good to great, you're not going to make it. You have to understand that the world is changing around you all the time. And then, alongside everything else I've said, get that value system of that organization right. Give it the focus, commit to hard work, hire the best talent, hire people smarter than yourself, and feel completely unashamed about it, because it's those people on whose back you're going to ride to success. Have a lot of meritocracy, but also have a lot of empathy. And then, finally, all you've got to do, frankly, is execute, execute, execute. Once you've made all of that money, and you have money to spend, please understand one thing. Tomorrow's organization, if you want to go from good to great, if you want to become a global organization, coming out of these markets, you have to take a stakeholder approach. You cannot take a shareholder approach. We cannot be slaves to profit alone. We cannot focus on profit alone. We have to understand that our stakeholders embrace our entire communities. Everybody that we touch. Tomorrow, when somebody walks into a supermarket and they see 3 bottles of water on the shelf, they will buy the one that they feel is empathetic to their needs as a community. And that, to me, is one of the most crucial innovations that the future holds. And of course, there's this great rebalancing going on of the world. We are moving towards us, we're moving towards these growth markets. So I feel these are some common parameters that I found have a unique perspective in terms of the companies that I've seen. I feel that at the end of the day, no one person's success can be replicated in others. Life as a journey is one where you just cannot stop, and hence there's no point at which you can say, I became great, I became successful. And so your own journey, as you take this discussion forward, is going to be one of questions. How can I innovate? How can I think better? And how can I think faster? I didn't talk about statistics. I wanted to talk about the soft issues that affect how a business grows. But thank you for having me.
I'd welcome any questions to Arif Naqvi. Because the one which I was on my mind as I was listening, you were talking about entrepreneurs with self-belief, these people who are so driven and so ready to go for it. And yet, at the same time, you're talking about organizations crossing borders. How do you change? Because you've taken over these companies, and then you build them from these entrepreneurial single entities, perhaps quite sort of individual-driven, into much larger structures. That is a major change, which can go wrong so often.
As Mr. Kamath said when he was up here, it's significantly more difficult to grow a company through acquisition than it is organically. And again, it then comes down to cultures, it comes down to mindset, it comes down to how the entrepreneur thinks. But at the same time, I feel a little bit cheated, because when I look at the charts of organizations like Tata, yes, they have 80% of their value coming out of acquisition growth, but to be perfectly honest, I think the way that ICICI Bank grew is dramatically greater because it's organic, it's supporting your customer base, and it's growing across markets on a value basis. I think he was being too kind by giving other examples. I think the example of his own organization is probably the best example of how to grow a company. When I look at entrepreneurs that we support growing across borders, I find that the common theme is the capacity to understand those markets, the commitment to work as hard in those, to hire the right people. So all the things that I was saying, because it's never one person that does it. It's a team, it's a combination of people.
Hands over the back there. Sorry, before you start, forgive me, sir. Could you please give your name and your batch number? Just tell us who you are before you ask the question.
Sanjeev, batch of 1987, I am Calcutta. Mr. Naqvi, just a quick question about culture and mindsets, and I think you touched on a very, very important topic. Most companies in the world are based on aggressive forward planning and processes, and that's what really makes them.
Sorry, I couldn't hear you.
Most companies in the world, or most successful companies, winning companies in the world, are based on aggressive forward planning and processes. Whereas there is a cultural mindset, which is the Jugaad mindset, which is more of a we can do with much less kind of attitude. Which is the winning formula, is it?
I don't think one or the other is, like I said, a successful formula. I think without planning, you're not going to get anywhere. And again, when I look at the great entrepreneurs of the world, the Gates and Bransons and so on, what I realize is that we have built this myth around entrepreneurs, because books are sold by myths, that an entrepreneur is one who is comfortable with failure and is willing to fail again and again and again until he stands up and makes it. The reality is that everyone that we seek to emulate hasn't failed. And they haven't failed because they are so detail-oriented. They are so focused on getting it right. They build the business plans, they build the thinking, they build the ideas. But the Jugaad element, as we've been now talking about, it's become institutionalized, it seems. Okay, this is part of the individual's DNA. It's like I keep saying, and with no disrespect to my friends that invest in these markets who are based out of the West, the large PE firms that are seeking to do investments, why is it that they haven't been that successful in emerging markets? in growth markets, because you can't make investment decisions out in Washington or New York around a country or an entity until you've eaten its food, until you've physically seen what that place is like. Long distance understanding has never helped. So cultural understanding married to extremely difficult and painstaking analysis, hard work, it's the same things, man. It's the same things we all know. But the reality is that, good fortune accompanies that effort. And if you've built a framework around it, I think, you are already one step ahead of the curve.
When you're talking of, at the end, you're talking of being more stakeholder focused rather than shareholder focused. Well and good. I can understand that the greed we were speaking of drove us to 2008 and 2009 and the crisis. How do you suggest that we should put stakeholder value onto the balance sheet? How can you account for it? How can you make it part of the working operations?
It's actually being done today. You have sustainability reports, you have all sorts of measures that the UNPRI and so on have put together that enable such a thing to happen. All the major accounting firms measure it for you and issue you with a report as well. But when I say that it's an imperative and you don't have a choice, okay, it's really about taking what in the 60s and 70s we used to call the good citizen approach and taking it one stage further and saying it's got to be a part of your business practice, of your ethic, and if you don't do it, someone else will, and they will overtake you. Today, I find young people coming out of universities, MBA students, and so on, that want to join us. First of all, they're all prima donnas, because once you've had an MBA and you've been to IIM and so on, you become very difficult to employ. But the reality is, so many of them are looking for the right work environment, not just the job that pays the most amount of money.
Arif, you gave an example of this healthcare company, the acquisition in Turkey and the one in Singapore. I think it's very interesting that two completely separate cultures like that. So how did you find the synergies and how did you actually merge these two companies?
So in a technocratic business, the commonality is technology, right? The technology is the provision of healthcare. Healthcare is universal. So high quality healthcare, whether you provide it in Singapore or in Turkey or Egypt or the United States, the protocols, the quality, all of that is identical, right? So building the front end of the business together, getting the high-end doctors to work together is very easy. They're doing that all the time anyway. The real issue becomes how the businesses are run. And again, in that particular case, I should have also pointed out, it was relatively easy because both sets of organizations were in a growth mode and neither dominated the other. So we're still in the evolutionary phase of it, but I don't foresee there being a cultural issue, even though they come from different parts of the world, because the business driver, which is medical provision and healthcare, is identical.
Question at the back. Your
Dr. Tahir
name
Akhtar, what we heard today is what we hear almost every day out in the market. We need business that we can grow. We need to put effort into the medium-sized businesses. We need to grow them into big business. And mostly it is about the orchids, the beautiful orchids. We have the orchids that are there. Let's turn them into beautiful commercial farms that they're producing more. But really nobody's talking about the nurseries. Where the nurseries where you can actually prepare the future companies. So nobody talks about the startups. Nobody's looking to invest in startups. I mean, across the MENA region, even the rest of the world. So when are you looking to develop a startup fund, not a SME fund, or where you can grow the small and medium to large, but a startup fund?
Well, the first thing is, if you've been hearing everything I've been saying every day, then I can retire because the message has been delivered. Second, without turning it into a party political broadcast, we actually have started a startup fund. You need to go to www.wamda.com and you'll begin to find the details. The reason why startup funds have not worked in the Middle East region, as they did in the US, venture capital has not taken off, is because you don't have an integrated market. The first time you had an integrated market in the Middle East was when satellite TV came on, and all of a sudden we utilized and exploited the synergy of language to bring down per unit cost of delivery of advertising to the consumer. By doing that, we unified the market around language. Language is not a strong enough parameter to build a business on. So these are very different markets. The reason we now feel that the market is big enough and stable enough and the opportunity is large enough is because working off the SME space, again, which I call high growth, small and mid cap, there is a tremendous opportunity to backward integrate and go further down into the startup businesses, because that's what feeds that. So far, this market has been totally focused on the larger scale and the acquisition-driven opportunity. Again, that's where we feel strongly that the small and mid cap is really the route in the future, and I have invested very aggressively into that space.